We are going to continue our discussion of the expansion of Japan in Asia. Now we are pushing into the 1930s, and this is where Japan really starts their aggressive action towards their neighbors, especially China, and that's where we want to start our conversation today. Another factor that is leading to Japanese expansion in East Asia is the political instability in China. And I want to spend a few more minutes talking about what's going on in China. You guys read a few pages on this the other day. China looks like this, largely, after 1911. If you guys remember from your AP World class a couple years ago, you might have sung a song called the Chinese Dynasty Song, where you went through 2,000 years of Chinese dynastic history to the tune of Frere Jacques, and ultimately you get, at the end of that, the last verse is Wan Ming Qing Republic. Republic is a fancy word that essentially means there's not a king or an emperor anymore. And so in 1911, the last Qing emperor is deposed, all right? And China will go from a centralized state, which it has been for largely 2,000 years, to this decentralized, warlord, regional domination entity, all right? So there's no unified China anymore. Now, as we push into the 1920s, there's two main factions that China is going to, that will attempt to unify China under one united rule. And we should be familiar with these two guys. On the left here, we have a guy named Zhang Jixi. You have seen his name likely before as Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek and Zhang Jixi are one and the same. This is an issue of transliteration, and we see it throughout any study of Chinese history, where China doesn't have, like, our Latin alphabet. And so when things are translated from Chinese into English, there are different, and over time we've kind of adapted different common ways to write these names. This is the present-day, more commonly accepted way to say Chiang Kai-shek, so Zhang Jixi. This is likely what the IB will be using. But through readings, be familiar with both. In fact, I think your book that you're reading uses Chiang Kai-shek. All right? Chiang Kai-shek is the leader of the Chinese Nationalist Party. The Chinese Nationalist Party is called the KMT, or Kuomintang. But because of transliteration, you might also see GMD, Kuomintang. One and the same. Okay? So Chiang Kai-shek is to Zhang Jixi, as Kuomintang is to Kuomintang. It's all, they're the same ideas. It is the Chinese Nationalist Party. Essentially, what we need to know about the Chinese nationalists is that they believe China should be united under one central government. Zhang Jixi should be that leader. And foreign influence and foreign domination should be pushed out. And that now includes Japan. All right? Now, to the right, we have Mao Zedong. Mao is the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao is the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. And he has a lot of the same goals as Zhang Jixi. He wants to unite China. But he wants it united under his leadership as a communist party, or a communist state. He wants to drive foreign influence and outsiders, including the Japanese, out. So from 1926 to 1928, a movement in China led by Zhang Jixi and the nationalists called the Northern Expedition will take place. And during the beginning months of this Northern Expedition, Zhang Jixi and Mao Zedong will unite forces into what is called the United Front. They will kind of joke, because they have common goals. Unite China, drive foreign interference and foreign incursions in China out. So the United Front will push through China from the south to the north in a northern expedition in hopes of wrangling in all of these disparate, where are they at? All of these disparate warlord-dominated regions. All right? You gotta knock these guys all on the head to bring them into one united China again. Ultimately, though, by 1927, the differences between the KMT, the Kuomintang, and the Communist Party are too great, and that united front kind of falls apart and turns into the beginning of what we know as the Chinese Civil War. The Chinese Civil War is going to be a story that you're going to hear about for a while in this class, because it begins in the late 1920s. It will press through much of the 1930s. We're going to take a break for World War II, and then it resumes after World War II up until its ultimate end in 1949. So the Chinese Civil War, this conflict between the Nationalists and the Communists, between Zhang Jixi and Mao Zedong, will be a story in Chinese history for much of the next 25 years. Yes, ma'am? It was from 26 to 28, but in the midst of that northern expedition, the CCP and the KMT will break. All right? And so what do we see in China is a lot of political instability. We're not sure who's in charge. There's no united China right now. And this, for Japan, makes China look like it is ripe for the picking. Everybody see that? Cool. Yeah. They were successful in uniting much of China, but not all of it yet. And that is a good segue to another man we need to be familiar with. This is Manchurian warlord Zhang Zuolin. Zhang Zuolin. I am all for anybody for Halloween this year being a Manchurian warlord, because that just sounds really cool, right? Yeah, that'd be a sweet costume if you could throw that together. Manchurian warlord Zhang Zuolin, he's the guy that's kind of running the show up in Manchuria. And we need to remember, guys, about China, it is a massive state, even during the dynastic era. It is a massive state. And Manchuria is a major region of the traditional China. But it's filled with Manchu people. They're not the same ethnic background as the rest of China. When the Qing dynasty in the 1600s toppled the Ming, it was an outside invasion, much like the Mongols coming in and taking over China back in the 1200s. The Manchu invaded and took over China in the 1600s. They're a different ethnicity, even though, like most ugly American is the phrase for kind of the Americans that don't recognize a lot of the intricacies of the world around them. Would look at this guy and say, he's Chinese, because he looks Chinese. But they wouldn't recognize that this is like a different ethnic group. He's a different person from the Han Chinese that make up much of mainland China. Zhang Zuolin is running Manchuria. He's a Manchurian warlord. What do you think he wants as being a Manchurian warlord? Yes? He might want more land. Do you think he wants to be brought into the nationalist China under Zhang Jixi? No. He doesn't want Manchuria to be overrun by this northern expedition. He wants to maintain his autonomy, right? And so he actually gets in cahoots with Japan. He will side up with Japan and get some aid from Japan. And Japan wants to see this guy in existence because Japan doesn't want to see Manchuria fall into a united China. Because if China unites, then it becomes that much more difficult for Japan to move into and exploit. So as long as they have a fractured China, even if Manchurian warlord Zhang Zuolin is running Manchuria, that is better for Japan in the long run. But as the northern expedition starts to make its way towards Manchuria, and as it starts to fracture as the united front falls apart, Zhang Zuolin's eyes get a little big. And he says, we might be able to expand here. We might be able to push our borders out a little bit. So he starts to use his Manchurian forces to push against mainland China. And Japan can't have this. Because if he starts going to war against the Chinese nationalists and he loses, what happens to Manchuria? The nationalists take over, and then it's harder for Japan to get the influence that they want. So this guy, according to Japan, has got to go. And he will be assassinated. They get rid of him. He is a troublemaker. He is assassinated. Who is he assassinated by? Japanese. And we want to be familiar with this group. These are Japanese soldiers in Manchuria called the Kwantung Army. Japanese soldiers in Manchuria called the Kwantung Army. Why does Japan have soldiers in Manchuria? Ever since the Sino-Japanese War, and even more so after the Russo-Japanese War, Japan had gained what we call a sphere of influence in Manchuria. They got economic concessions, they got industrial concessions, they've been building railroads in southern Manchuria to get resources out of southern Manchuria, and they've got an army there to protect Japanese interests. Now, you'd say, this seems weird. Why does a foreign nation get to do all this stuff? This is what everybody was doing to China, all right? There were American soldiers in China. There were German soldiers in China before World War I. There were French soldiers in China. There were British soldiers in China. Everybody was picking apart China and basing spheres of influence there. The Kwantung Army is the Japanese military in Manchuria. And when Zuolin starts to ruffle some feathers, officers within the Kwantung Army move to assassinate him. This is not met with happiness from the Japanese leadership, from the Japanese government, from the Emperor of Japan, whose name is Emperor Hirohito. You should be familiar with Emperor Hirohito. He will be the Emperor of Japan through the 1930s and 40s, through the Second World War and afterwards. We'll talk much more about him. I believe so. Yeah, he was young at the start here. This move to assassinate Zhang Zuolin was not sanctioned by the Japanese government. All right? And Emperor Hirohito ordered the Prime Minister of Japan at the time, a guy named Tanaka, to rein in that military, to rein in the Kwantung Army. That the officers responsible for that assassination should be brought up on charges as murderers. And Tanaka doesn't do it. Tanaka maybe can't do it. Because what do people in Japan, what does the Japanese populace think of the military? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. They're heroes. They love them. That's what they've been taught since birth. And now, when it's looking like the military in Manchuria is making positive moves for Japan, it's getting good press. And Japan is a democracy. And representatives of the Diet, the Japanese legislature, are popularly elected by universal male suffrage. And Tanaka doesn't see that he has the political will to go topple this Kwantung Army. And so he cannot follow through with the emperor's orders. Now, we've already said this. The emperor in Japan, how is he seen? Divine emperor, like a god on earth. So as Tanaka can't follow through with the emperor's orders, he resigns in disgrace. He quits. All right? But this does not solve the problem of the Kwantung Army. We are beginning to get the picture in Japan. Who is running the show there? The Japanese military, and this will only push further. After Tanaka resigns, a new prime minister named Hamaguchi Yuko comes to power. Now, guys, these names are as new to me in teaching this as they are to you. Unless anyone in here has all of the Japanese prime ministers memorized. They flop over a lot more than American presidents, so it's a very challenging ordeal to memorize them. These names are challenging. What I hope out of you, they are on your standards. I will not be asking you specific questions on assessments about these guys' names, these smaller figures. But what I would hope is when we get to the IB exam and you see a name like Hamaguchi Yuko in a document, that you're like, oh yeah, I remember he's the Prime Minister of Japan. But the IB will do you one better. If they ever give you a name like Hamaguchi Yuko on an assessment, it will put in parentheses after that, Japanese Prime Minister. Or it will give it to you in a little caption to the document. It'll let you know this is the Prime Minister. So you don't really have to stress too much about this for at least paper 1. So we got a new Prime Minister in Japan, Hamaguchi Yuko, and he tries to rein in the Japanese economy and the military, and he will ultimately fail as well. Now, he comes to power in 1929. This is at the time of the start of the Great Depression. Economic concerns are going to weigh on his administration and on the nation of Japan. In an attempt to solve those economic concerns, he will try to cut the national budget. But we've already said, by 1914, the national budget was 50% military, right? And a lot of that comes from salaries. And so he will move to cut the salaries of the officer class and of other bureaucrats in the Japanese government. And this will make the military deeply resentful towards this guy. He's also going to take part in a meeting in London called the London Naval Conference. This is in 1930. There's going to be another London Naval Conference we're going to talk about in a few more years. So this ends up being the first London Naval Conference. And just like at the 5-power naval treaty back at the Washington Conference, the London Naval Conference is another international agreement that is working to limit the size of nations' navies, particularly focused on submarine navies during this conference. And this makes sense because it's 1930 and nobody wants war, and war is expensive and navies are expensive, and the Great Depression is raging, so it's a good time to agree to these limits. But just like the Washington Conference, which put Britain and the United States in a superior position to whatever the Japanese Navy could become, the London Naval Conference does the same. So now you have the military of Japan doubly angry with this guy. And what do you think the military of Japan will do when they're angry with the political leadership in Japan? Let's get rid of him. And assassins move and shoot Hamaguchi Yuko. They don't kill him, but he is incapacitated for a while, and within months he will step down from the Prime Minister's office. Again, who is running the show in Japan? The military, right? The political leadership better toe the line of what the military wants to do, or the political leadership will lose popular support, because the people love the military, because they've been taught, because their textbooks tell them to, or the military itself will move against them. Cool? Cool. Then we have the Great Depression strike. Or amidst all of these crises, we have the Great Depression strike. Now, the Great Depression starts in the United States. All right? It is an American phenomenon. Did you talk at all about the Great Depression last year in class? I don't think you really got there, right? Okay, there's a lot of factors that lead to it, and we aren't spending much time at all dealing with the origins of the Great Depression. But you've got a lot of issues of American overproduction and eventually prices falling, and then this downward turning economic cycle where prices fall and businesses aren't doing as well, and so then they start to lay people off, and then you've got rising unemployment, and when unemployment is on the rise, you have fewer people that can buy goods, so businesses have to contract even more, and as businesses contract even more, they lay more people off, and then you have more people that can't afford to buy goods. All the while, during the 1920s, the roaring 20s, we have all these new technological developments like refrigerators and washing machines that people have been buying with credit. When times were good and the jobs were plentiful in the 1920s, people borrowed a lot of money and bought a lot of items on credit. Well, after the Depression hits, when people start being unemployed, they can't pay back their loans anymore. Bada boom, bada bing, in October of 1929, the stock market in the United States crashes. All right? Many Americans who had investments tied up in stocks were out. They lost. And just as people were borrowing money to buy washing machines and refrigerators, the stock market had done so well through the 1920s that people were actually borrowing money to buy stocks, which can be a fine thing. If you believe the stock market will continue to grow. But once the stocks crash, now you have bought stocks with borrowed money. Your stocks are now depleted in value, but you still owe the same amount of money you borrowed in the first place. All right? So the Great Depression starts in the United States. But just as today, not to today's extent, but just as today, the world economy is interconnected. Nations do business with each other. Nations trade with each other. And so when the Great Depression strikes in the United States, any country that the United States does trade with, and any country that wants to trade to the United States will be impacted. Japan is no exception to this. And in fact, Japan will be deathly afraid of the effects of the Great Depression because they are so reliant on foreign exports coming into Japan, especially in terms of commodities like steel and oil, iron and coal. They need these resources in Japan. So as Japan is dependent on foreign trade, and the Great Depression threatens to disrupt foreign trade, Japan is going to be forced to look to become more self-sufficient. They've got to be able to rely on themselves for their own resources, which means look more seriously across the Sea of Japan to Manchuria. Now, one side note to this, and I think this is important to hear in the midst of our current presidential election and some of the rhetoric that we're hearing. After the Great Depression struck, one of the first moves by the American government to solve the problems that the Depression was bringing was to pass one of the largest protective tariffs in American history. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. All right? It is an artificial barrier to trade that makes foreign goods more expensive so people would be more likely to buy American-produced goods. That is why tariffs exist. And I mention it with our current presidential election because Donald Trump has on many occasions threatened to impose taxes on goods made overseas before they come in the United States from places even like Mexico where we have free trade agreements right now with them. All right? This tariff in 1929 was called 1930, pardon me, was called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. Just because Mr. and Mrs. Hawley, Mr. and Mrs. Smoot had kids that went into Congress. That's why it gets that name, okay? The Hawley-Smoot Tariff. It is the largest protectionist tariff issued during peacetime in American history. And it would cause the prices of Japanese imports in the United States to rise 200%. Or cause taxes on those imports to rise 200%. It's making Japanese goods far more expensive. So when Japanese goods are far more expensive in the United States, guess what Americans stop buying? Japanese goods, which hurts the American economy. But the problem with tariffs, like if the United States alone were the only country to throw a tariff at imported goods, then it wouldn't have such disastrous impacts. But when the United States starts passing protectionist tariffs, other countries will do the same. And then we have what we call trade wars ensuing. Well, if you're going to charge higher taxes on my goods coming into your country, I will charge higher taxes on your goods coming into my country. Ha! Right? And so now we have rising trade costs throughout the world, so declining trade throughout the world. And nations like Japan, nations like the United States that rely on foreign trade, they will be harmed. So most would agree today that the Hawley-Smoot tariff did not help the problem of the Great Depression, all right? But what it absolutely does is it harms the Japanese economy and makes them realize that they can't rely forevermore on foreign trade. One little anecdote that you can maybe put in the back of your mind. One of the chief Japanese exports at this time, in 1930, was silk. Japanese silk industry brought in more wealth to Japan than any other good that they exported. And with the onset of the Great Depression, you've got like a double whammy happening, right? And for the United States, who buys a lot of silk shirts and ties and scarves and stockings and all these different things that you can make out of silk. Silk coming from Japan will be made artificially more expensive because of these tariffs. But then, to add insult to injury for Japan, silk is kind of a luxury good. There are other cloths and other materials that you can make these things out of, that when the economy crashes and people have less resources, when people have less disposable income, they stop buying luxury goods. They stop buying the high-end stuff, right? And they might move to other alternatives that are more affordable, right? So this is a double whammy for the Japanese economy, and we will see silk prices in Japan plummet to 1/5 of their 1923 value, all right? And that means the silk industry in Japan will suffer, and then when the silk industry is suffering, what does the silk industry do? It starts to collapse, it lays workers off, and now you have unemployment on the rise in Japan. All of these things are interconnected. Japan needs to become self-sufficient for materials, and Manchuria will be looked at again. Okay? Now, while some in Japan see Manchuria and the acquisition of the resources in Manchuria as Japan's only means of survival, it would still need to be taken by force. Because the Chinese nationalists aren't going to want to see a Japanese army marching across Manchuria to conquer the entirety of that region. Because they might start to get nervous that Japan will push even further. So that could lead to a major war with Chinese nationalists. And so we know that if Manchuria is to be taken, it's going to have to be taken by force. And the Japanese government does not want to go here, because what has the Japanese government been doing for the last 10 years? Have they been being fervent nationalists trying to expand, or have they been more of an internationalist trying to work with other nations? The Japanese government has been very internationalist. League of Nations membership, signing on to the 4-Power Treaty and the 5-Power Treaty and the 9-Power Treaty. We haven't mentioned the Kellogg-Briand Pact yet. We will talk about that. But in 1929, nations of the world got together and signed a pact called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, an agreement that said war is not an option in solving international disputes. Nobody wants to fight wars. Right? They signed the London Naval Agreement in 1930. This is an internationalist government of Japan. It wants to be seen as a player in the world. As such, it is making agreements with the world. And if they were to move on Manchuria, that would destroy all of that, right? Well, the Kwantung Army is going to do it on its own. The Kwantung Army is going to move on Manchuria on its own, without the wishes of the emperor, without the wishes of the Japanese government. Now, take a time out. Why would they do this? Why is the Kwantung Army going rogue here? What benefit might they get out of this? Yes? Okay, they might get some resources out of that area. They might get wealth, maybe, yeah? If they do good things, if they conquer, right, if they win military victories, they will become even more prestigious, and in Japan they will become even more powerful. And remember, it's not like the private soldiers that are making these rules, it's the officer class. And it's the officers that, through military victory, through more prestige, will rise up in rank, right? When you rise up in rank, what do you get? You get better pay, right? This is job security, right? This is looking for advancement. So the Kwantung Army is going to do its own thing in Manchuria. And that will start near a town called Mukden, M-U-K-D-E-N. On September 18th, 1931, I don't care about the 18th of September. You might not memorize that. But 1931 is a year you should know for this. On September 18th, 1931, there will be an explosion at a Japanese-owned railway outside of the town of Mukden in Manchuria. The Kwantung Army that is there to defend Japanese interests will blame Chinese nationalist terrorists for blowing up this Japanese-owned railway. Later evidence will reveal that the more likely culprit of these bombs was the Kwantung Army itself, not Chinese nationalists. Why would the Kwantung Army blow up its own railway and blame Chinese nationalists? Yes, ma'am. They have a reason to expand, and we associated a phrase with this at one of our very first lectures this year, and we called that a reason for war. We called it give a Latin phrase for it? A casus belli, a pretext for war. They bombed us. Now we are going to go and attack them. We have justification. We have reason for attacking them. This is the pretext for war in Manchuria. Now the Japanese government says, stop! Don't do this! This is going to ruin all of the international goodwill we've been trying to build up for years now. And the Kwantung Army proceeds, refusing to heed the government's call to stop hostilities. By 1932, all of Manchuria, yes ma'am, Gianni. Yeah, we already talked about the Diet. The legislature of Japan has what we call the power of the purse. They can fund the military. That's where the money comes from. But the Diet is popularly elected. There's universal male suffrage. And the military is wildly popular in Japan. And so if you're a government official and you start turning against the military, or you try to restrict their ability to fight this fight, you will likely lose elections. You will be toppled. Maybe you'll have a revolution in Japan. Maybe you guys heard the phrase a military coup? A coup? You might have a coup. You might have the military, because they're so popular, turn on you. So just like the military is doing what it thinks it needs to do to better its own prospects, the Japanese government is impotent to do anything to stop it, because they don't want to be cut out. Japan will take over all of Manchuria by early 1932. It becomes a new nation, essentially, a new state, but not truly independent, called Manchukuo. So if you ever see Manchukuo, it is Manchuria after the Japanese have taken it over. So Manchukuo is the Japanese Manchuria. It will be established as what we call a puppet state. A puppet state, much like a puppet where a marionette is pulling the strings, Japan will prop up this man. His name is Puyi, as the puppet emperor of Manchukuo. Now, Puyi's got a lot of street cred, because Puyi, back in 1911, was the last Qing emperor of China. When he was deposed back in 1911, he was just a little guy. There's a really good movie that Steven Spielberg did years ago that you probably have never seen called The Last Emperor that details his life through the 20th century. And this guy was a young boy when the Chinese Qing dynasty fell. He lived through the Civil War era. He lived through the Japanese taking Manchuria. He became the emperor of Manchukuo. He's going to continue through the Second World War. After the Second World War, the Chinese Civil War resumes. Eventually, the nationalists in China lose, and China is united under communist rule, and he's gobbled up by the communists for re-education. All right? It's a fascinating story if you read more about Pu Yi and his life. So he is propped up as a puppet emperor of Manchukuo, but he's really got no power control. It's Japan that is running Manchukuo. All right? Fighting would also break out in Shanghai. Fighting would also break out in Shanghai, the largest city in Japan, where the Japanese Air Force would start bombing the city, leading to thousands upon thousands of civilian casualties. And if we were to look at this picture of burned out buildings, we wouldn't be able to tell whether this was any other city during the Second World War. A sign of things to come in future war. China would ultimately agree in 1933, in May of 1933, to cede control of Manchuria to Japan. China gives up on it. This is Zhang Jixi, Chiang Kai-shek, says, all right, Manchuria is yours, Japan. You can have it. It's Manchukuo. We're not messing with it. This does not, yes, ma'am. Because they want Manchuria. They don't want the Chinese government to interfere in their taking of Manchuria, so they start bombing Shanghai, and China is virtually defenseless to stop it. So Zhang Jixi says, all right, no mas. Well, you got it. We're not going to mess with you. Even though Zhang Jixi does not want the Japanese in control of Manchuria. But what he says, and I think this is important to kind of keep in the back of our minds, he says the Japanese are like a disease of the skin, while communism is a disease of the heart. And if you have both a disease of the skin going on and a disease of the heart going on, which do you deal with first? You got to take care of that. So in Zhang Jixi mind, Manchuria is the hinterlands. Manchuria is far away. Communism is within. Chinese nationalists might tomorrow turn in to Chinese communists. A Chinese person will not turn into a Japanese person. The Chinese people hate the Japanese. The Chinese people would fight against Japan if they ever pushed further into China. Communism, in Zhang Jixi's mind, needs to be stopped first. And his hope with Manchuria and the Japanese is that they have no concept of how big this place really is and how hard it's going to be to control it. His hope is that the Japanese will stretch themselves so thin by being in Manchuria that eventually they'll just be able to be swept away. But we can deal with that at a later date. The primary concern for Zhang Jixi is defeating the communists under Mao Zedong. All right? The results of this, and I'm almost done, guys. The results of this. Japan is now on the outside of the world. Their relationship with the United States, their relationship with Great Britain, their relationship with the League of Nations, of which they were a member, destroyed. The League of Nations will condemn these actions in Manchuria, and Japan will just be like, we're out of here. You condemn me, I will leave you. And Japan leaves the League of Nations. The internationalist Japan of the 1920s is now the nationalist Japan of the 1930s. While Zhang Jixi in China will focus on the communists, there will be anti-Japanese boycotts in China. Japanese goods boycotted in China. What will this do to the Japanese economy? You used to be able to sell stuff in China. Now you've lost those markets. So that's not good for Japan. Ultimately, though, the occupation of Manchuria and the resources that could be exploited from Manchuria will be a net economic gain for Japan. But to have to maintain a massive army there is still expensive. So that negates some of the benefit of taking Manchuria. Yes? It's not so much Japan taking resources to sell on an open market. Japan is taking those resources to the industry of Japan. These are like raw materials that feed the Japanese industry, and countryside that can grow food for the Japanese people. Japan's military now is essentially controlling the government. The government has no control to stop Japanese military actions. And the public, wildly supportive of the military. Because look what the military did! Within months, they conquered a larger tract of land than the Japanese armies had taken during the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War and World War I combined. And they did it within months with very few casualties. The Japanese military are wildly popular in Japan. That is it.